Thank you for joining today's analysis. Today's topic is, the war just shifted to oil and the world is watching, exposing the strategic shift from military strikes to energy-centered warfare according to analysts. What we are witnessing right now is not just another escalation in the Middle East. It is a structural transformation of how modern conflict is being conducted. The recent strikes linked to Iranian responses targeting Saudi oil refineries, following the earlier attack on a gas facility associated with Israel and the United States, signal something far more profound than retaliation. They mark the emergence of energy infrastructure as the central battlefield of 21st century geopolitical confrontation. But the real question is not simply what happened. The real question is, why has the battlefield shifted? According to analysts, for decades, conflict in the Middle East followed a relatively predictable pattern: military bases, proxy groups, and localized engagements. Even when tensions escalated, the targets were often tied directly to military capability. However, the current phase breaks away from that model entirely. Now, the targets are no longer just soldiers or weapons systems. They are pipelines, refineries, export terminals, strategic energy nodes. And this changes everything. According to analysts, Iran's decision to focus on Saudi oil infrastructure represents a calculated escalation. It reflects a transition from symbolic or tactical retaliation to systemic disruption. Saudi Arabia is not just another regional actor. It is one of the world's most critical energy suppliers. Any disruption to its refining capacity carries consequences that extend far beyond the Middle East. This is where the true weight of the situation becomes clear. Because when energy becomes the target, the entire global system becomes vulnerable. According to analysts, this move must also be understood within the framework of deterrence. The earlier strike on a gas facility linked to Iran's strategic energy interests created a precedent. By responding with attacks on oil refineries, Iran is sending a direct and unmistakable signal. Any attack on its economic lifelines will be met with proportional damage to those of its adversaries. This is not random escalation. This is calibrated symmetry, and it introduces a dangerous new logic into the conflict, one where economic pain becomes the primary language of deterrence. But here is where the situation becomes even more complex. According to analysts, energy infrastructure is inherently more difficult to defend than traditional military targets. Unlike fortified bases, oil facilities are expansive, exposed, and often geographically dispersed. Protecting every node within a national energy network is not only costly, it is practically impossible to achieve with complete certainty. This creates a strategic imbalance. A relatively low-cost strike can generate disproportionately high economic damage. A single disruption can halt production, shake investor confidence, and trigger immediate reactions in global markets. And that brings us to another critical dimension: psychological impact. According to analysts, the moment an oil refinery is targeted, the effects are not limited to physical damage. Markets react instantly. Oil prices fluctuate. Supply concerns rise. Governments begin reassessing risk exposure. The psychological shockwave spreads faster than any physical consequence. In this sense, energy infrastructure becomes more than a target. It becomes a pressure point on the entire global system. So the next question is inevitable. Is this still a regional conflict? Or has it already become something much larger? According to analysts, the answer is increasingly leaning toward the latter. When energy flows are threatened, the implications reach Europe, Asia, and beyond. Countries dependent on stable oil supplies are indirectly pulled into the strategic equation. Insurance costs rise. Shipping routes become more sensitive. Even distant economies begin to feel the ripple effects. This is how a localized conflict transforms into a global concern. And within this evolving landscape, Saudi Arabia's position is also changing rapidly. According to analysts, Saudi Arabia is no longer just a stakeholder observing regional tensions. It is becoming a central node within the conflict itself. Once its energy infrastructure is directly targeted, it cannot remain neutral or detached. Its strategic decisions now carry implications not just for itself, but for global energy stability. This raises another critical question. What happens when more countries become directly exposed? According to analysts, the risk of regional expansion increases significantly. Energy networks are interconnected, and any disruption can cascade across multiple countries. As more actors become vulnerable, the probability of broader involvement grows. And with that comes an even greater danger: miscalculation. In a conflict environment where economic assets are targeted, responses can become unpredictable. A single misinterpretation or overreaction could trigger a chain of events that is difficult to contain. According to analysts, this is one of the most fragile phases of the conflict, not because of the scale of destruction, but because of the complexity of interdependence. At the same time, a deeper strategic layer is unfolding. According to analysts, this shift toward energy warfare reflects a broader evolution in modern conflict. Traditional military dominance no longer guarantees strategic advantage. Instead, the ability to disrupt economic systems, influence markets, and control critical resources is becoming equally, if not more, important. In other words, the definition of power is changing. It is no longer just about firepower. It is about leverage. And energy is one of the most powerful forms of leverage in the world today. So as we look at the unfolding situation, one final question emerges: who benefits from this shift? According to analysts, instability in global energy markets can create indirect advantages for other major producers. Countries capable of maintaining stable output during periods of disruption may see increased influence and economic gains. This introduces an additional layer of geopolitical competition, one that operates quietly but carries significant long-term implications. And this is why the current moment is so critical, because what appears to be a series of retaliatory strikes may, in reality, be the early stages of a much larger transformation, a transition from conventional conflict to a multidimensional struggle where energy, economics, and strategy are deeply intertwined. According to analysts, we are no longer looking at isolated incidents. We are looking at the emergence of a new kind of war. A war where the battlefield is not just land or air, but the global energy system itself. And what happens next may redefine the balance of power far beyond the Middle East. Part 2. Understanding the deeper architecture, strategic foundations, military doctrine, and the evolution of energy-centered conflict. According to analysts, to fully understand the escalation described in Part 1, it is necessary to step back and examine the deeper strategic architecture that has shaped this conflict over time. What appears today as a sudden shift toward targeting energy infrastructure is, in reality, the result of long-term doctrinal evolution, asymmetric capability development, and structural vulnerabilities embedded within the regional and global system. At the core of this confrontation lies a fundamental asymmetry. On one side, the United States and Israel possess advanced conventional military superiority, precision strike capabilities, intelligence dominance, integrated air defense systems, and global logistical reach. Their strategic doctrine has traditionally emphasized rapid dominance, technological superiority, and the ability to neutralize threats through targeted operations. On the other side, Iran has developed a very different model. According to analysts, Iran's strategic foundation is built on asymmetric warfare, strategic patience, and distributed power projection. Rather than matching conventional strength, Iran has invested in capabilities designed to exploit weaknesses, both military and economic, within its adversaries. This includes three critical pillars. First, the development of low-cost, high-impact strike systems. These include drones, short and medium-range missiles, and other scalable platforms capable of reaching strategic targets without requiring large-scale deployment. Second, the expansion of regional influence through aligned networks and indirect pressure mechanisms, allowing Iran to operate beyond its immediate borders while maintaining plausible deniability in certain contexts. Third, and increasingly important, the ability to target economic infrastructure as a means of strategic leverage. This third pillar is now moving to the center of the conflict. According to analysts, the recent focus on energy infrastructure reflects a deliberate shift toward what can be described as economic warfare integration. This is not separate from military strategy, it is an extension of it. Historically, warfare has always included economic dimensions, from naval blockades in earlier centuries to industrial targeting during major global conflicts. Disrupting an opponent's economic base has been a consistent objective. However, What distinguishes the current situation is the precision and immediacy with which economic pressure can now be applied. Energy infrastructure represents the most direct pathway to achieve this. Oil refineries, gas processing facilities, and transportation corridors are not only economically vital, they are also operationally sensitive. A disruption at a single node can reduce output, delay exports, and trigger cascading effects across supply chains. According to analysts, this creates a new type of strategic leverage, one that does not rely on territorial control, but on systemic disruption. This aligns closely with Iran's broader doctrine of asymmetric attrition. Rather than seeking decisive battlefield victories, the objective is to impose sustained pressure over time, forcing adversaries to allocate increasing resources to defense, recovery, and stabilization. This approach gradually shifts the cost-benefit balance of the conflict. And here, technology plays a critical role. According to analysts, the evolution of drone warfare and precision-guided munitions has significantly lowered the barrier to entry for strategic-level impact. Systems that are relatively inexpensive to produce can bypass traditional defenses and reach high-value targets. This creates a situation where defense becomes more expensive than offense. For the United States and Israel, protecting energy infrastructure across a wide geographic area requires layered defense systems, constant surveillance, and rapid response capabilities. The cost of maintaining such a posture is substantial. For Iran, however, the cost of launching limited but targeted strikes is comparatively lower. This imbalance is at the heart of the current strategic dynamic. But beyond technology, there is also a historical dimension to consider. According to analysts, the Middle East has long been shaped by the intersection of energy and geopolitics. Control over oil resources has influenced alliances, conflicts, and global power structures for decades. What is changing now is not the importance of energy, but how it is being contested. In earlier periods, control meant physical occupation or political alignment. Today, control can also mean disruption. And disruption does not require permanent presence, only the ability to create uncertainty. This is why the current phase of the conflict is particularly sensitive. According to analysts, the strategic objectives of each actor are becoming more clearly defined. For Iran, the goal is to establish credible deterrence by demonstrating that it can impose economic costs beyond its immediate borders. By targeting Saudi infrastructure, Iran is not only responding to previous attacks, it is signaling that the geographic scope of retaliation is expanding. For Israel, the objective remains focused on limiting threats to its national security, particularly those related to strategic capabilities and regional influence. This includes preventing the consolidation of hostile infrastructure that could alter the balance of power. For the United States, the challenge is broader. According to analysts, Washington is not only managing bilateral dynamics, but also safeguarding the stability of the global energy system. This includes ensuring that supply routes remain open, that key partners are protected, and that market disruptions are contained. And for Saudi Arabia, the situation represents a turning point. According to analysts, Saudi Arabia's strategic posture is shifting from a position of relative insulation to one of direct exposure. As its energy infrastructure becomes a target, its role within the conflict becomes more active, whether by necessity or by design. This convergence of objectives creates a highly complex strategic environment. Each actor is operating under different constraints, pursuing different goals, and responding to different pressures. Yet all are now connected through a shared vulnerability, energy infrastructure. This interconnectedness increases the risk of escalation. According to analysts, when multiple actors depend on the same systems, disruptions can trigger overlapping responses. A strike intended as limited retaliation may be interpreted as a broader escalation, leading to countermeasures that extend beyond the original scope. This is where doctrine meets uncertainty. Because while each side may operate according to its own strategic logic, the interaction between those logics can produce outcomes that are difficult to predict. And this brings us to a final critical point for this stage of analysis. According to analysts, the current conflict is no longer defined solely by who controls territory or who possesses superior military strength. It is increasingly defined by who can shape the strategic environment, who can influence costs, risks, and perceptions across multiple domains. Energy, in this context, is not just a resource. It is a strategic instrument. And as long as it remains at the center of the conflict, the dynamics we are observing will continue to evolve, potentially in ways that extend far beyond traditional expectations. Part 3. Mapping the real battlefield, strategic mechanisms, operational dynamics, and the shifting balance of power according to analysts. As the conflict transitions into an energy-centered confrontation, the actual battlefield is no longer defined by frontlines in the traditional sense. Instead, it is distributed across multiple layers: physical infrastructure, economic systems, and strategic signaling. Understanding how this war is being conducted in real terms requires examining the mechanisms through which pressure is applied and how each actor is recalibrating its position within a rapidly shifting balance of power. At the operational level, the conflict is unfolding through what can be described as selective disruption. According to analysts, rather than attempting large-scale destruction, the focus is on targeting critical nodes, specific facilities whose disruption can generate disproportionate systemic effects. Oil refineries, processing plants, and export terminals are not just industrial assets. They are strategic choke points within a global network. This approach reflects a refined targeting logic. The objective is not to destroy everything, but to destabilize enough to create uncertainty. And uncertainty, in energy markets, is itself a strategic outcome. When a refinery is disrupted, even temporarily, the impact is magnified by the interconnected nature of supply chains. Production schedules shift, transportation routes adjust, insurance premiums increase, and market expectations become volatile. According to analysts, this creates a feedback loop. A limited strike leads to market reaction. Market reaction amplifies economic pressure. Economic pressure influences political decision-making. And political responses feed back into the strategic environment. This loop is now a central mechanism of the conflict. At the same time, the concept of deterrence is being redefined. Traditionally, deterrence relied on the threat of overwhelming military retaliation. However, in the current context, according to analysts, deterrence is increasingly based on the ability to impose sustained economic disruption. This is where Iran's strategy becomes particularly significant. By demonstrating the capability to reach and affect high-value energy targets, Iran is attempting to establish a new equilibrium, one in which any attack on its own strategic assets will result in comparable economic consequences for its adversaries. This is not about escalation for its own sake. It is about shaping expectations. If all parties believe that attacking energy infrastructure will trigger reciprocal damage, then the threshold for action may shift. But at the same time, if that threshold is crossed repeatedly, the system itself becomes more unstable. This creates a paradox. Deterrence and escalation begin to overlap. According to analysts, this overlap is one of the defining features of the current phase. Now, when we examine the balance of power, it becomes clear that the traditional metrics, troop strength, air superiority, naval capacity, are no longer sufficient to explain the dynamics. Instead, power is being redistributed across domains. In the military domain, the United States and Israel maintain clear advantages in precision strike capability, intelligence integration, and defensive systems. However, these advantages are optimized for conventional engagements. In the economic domain, vulnerabilities are more evenly distributed. Energy infrastructure, by its nature, is exposed. It cannot be fully shielded without incurring unsustainable costs. This creates an environment where even actors with less conventional strength can exert significant influence. According to analysts, this is where asymmetric strategy converges with systemic vulnerability. Iran does not need to match its adversaries in all domains. It only needs to be effective in the domains that matter most at this stage: energy and economic disruption. And this is precisely what is unfolding. At the same time, the operational burden on the United States and Israel is increasing. According to analysts, defending energy infrastructure requires a different allocation of resources compared to traditional military defense. Surveillance must cover broader areas. Response times must be shorter. Coordination between civilian and military systems becomes essential. This creates strategic strain. Resources that might otherwise be concentrated on offensive or deterrent capabilities are now being diverted to protection and stabilization. And this has long-term implications. Because in a prolonged conflict, the side that must defend more assets often incurs higher cumulative costs. This is the essence of asymmetric attrition. But there is another dimension that must be considered, the role of Saudi Arabia. According to analysts, Saudi Arabia is no longer operating at the periphery of the conflict. As its energy infrastructure becomes a focal point, it is effectively integrated into the strategic equation. This introduces new variables. Saudi Arabia must now balance its economic priorities with its security requirements. It must consider how to protect its infrastructure without escalating the conflict further. And it must navigate its relationships with both regional and global partners. This balancing act is complex, and any shift in Saudi policy could alter the broader dynamics. Meanwhile, the global dimension continues to expand. According to analysts, energy markets are responding not only to actual disruptions, but also to perceived risk. This means that even limited incidents can have outsized effects if they alter expectations about future stability. In this sense, perception becomes a strategic factor. Managing perception, through signaling, messaging, and calibrated actions, is now as important as managing physical operations. And this is where the concept of hybrid warfare becomes fully visible. According to analysts, the conflict is no longer confined to a single domain. It operates simultaneously across military, economic, and informational layers. Actions in one domain influence outcomes in another. A strike affects markets. Market reactions influence political decisions. Political decisions reshape military posture. This interconnected cycle defines the current battlefield. And within this cycle, timing becomes critical. According to analysts, the selection of when and where to act is just as important as the action itself. A strike carried out at a moment of market sensitivity can amplify its impact. A response delayed or accelerated can change how it is interpreted. This introduces a temporal dimension to strategy. It is not just about capability, it is about synchronization. So where does this leave the overall balance of power? According to analysts, the balance is not static, it is shifting. Not in a sudden or dramatic way, but through gradual adjustments in cost, risk, and influence. Each strike, each response, each market reaction contributes to this shift. And over time, these incremental changes can redefine the strategic landscape. This is why the current phase is so critical. Because the outcomes are not determined by a single decisive event. They are shaped by a series of interconnected decisions, each one influencing the next. And as long as energy remains at the center of this process, the conflict will continue to evolve in ways that challenge traditional assumptions about power, control, and stability. Final. Projecting the consequences, global geopolitical impact, systemic risks, and the future trajectory of energy-driven conflict according to analysts. As the conflict continues to evolve from a primarily military confrontation into a broader energy-centered struggle, its long-term consequences are beginning to extend far beyond the Middle East. What is unfolding is no longer confined to regional rivalries. It is gradually reshaping the structure of global geopolitics, economic stability, and strategic competition. At the center of this transformation lies one critical reality. Energy is no longer just a resource, it is a battlefield. And once energy becomes a battlefield, every country connected to the global economy becomes a stakeholder. According to analysts, the most immediate consequence of this shift is heightened volatility in global energy markets. Even limited disruptions to key infrastructure can trigger sharp fluctuations in oil prices, increase transportation costs, and place pressure on supply chains. This creates ripple effects that reach far into industrial production, inflation levels, and national economic planning. In practical terms, this means that a localized strike in the Middle East can influence fuel prices in Europe, manufacturing costs in Asia, and monetary policy decisions in major economies. This is the first layer of global impact. But there is a deeper layer beneath it. According to analysts, prolonged instability in energy supply creates opportunities for other major producers. Countries with the capacity to maintain stable output during periods of disruption can increase their market share, strengthen their geopolitical influence, and reshape long-term energy relationships. This introduces a secondary competition, one that operates quietly but carries strategic weight. It is not just about who is involved in the conflict. It is about who benefits from its consequences. And this shifts the global balance of power in subtle, but meaningful ways. At the same time, the burden on major powers, particularly the United States, is increasing. According to analysts, Washington now faces a dual challenge. On one hand, it must support its regional partners and ensure their security. On the other hand, it must maintain the stability of global energy flows, which are essential to the broader international system. This requires a complex allocation of resources. Protecting military assets is no longer sufficient. Critical infrastructure, shipping routes, and energy corridors must also be secured. This expands the scope of strategic responsibility and increases the cost of engagement. And as these costs rise, the strategic calculus begins to change. According to analysts, one of the key questions moving forward is sustainability. How long can each side maintain its current level of activity? For Iran, the use of asymmetric methods allows for relatively lower operational costs. Targeted disruptions can generate significant economic pressure without requiring large-scale deployment. For its adversaries, however, the cost of defense, repair, and stabilization is significantly higher. This imbalance creates a long-term dynamic. It favors persistence over intensity, and it suggests that the conflict may not end through decisive confrontation, but through gradual shifts in economic and strategic endurance. At the regional level, the implications are equally significant. According to analysts, Saudi Arabia's role is undergoing a structural transformation. As a central node in the global energy system, its exposure to direct targeting places it at the heart of the evolving conflict. This increases its strategic importance, but also its vulnerability. Saudi Arabia must now consider not only how to protect its infrastructure, but also how to position itself within a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. Its decisions, whether in security, diplomacy, or energy policy, will influence the direction of the conflict. And this leads to another critical concern: escalation risk. According to analysts, as more actors become directly or indirectly involved, the potential for miscalculation increases. A response intended as limited deterrence could be interpreted as a broader escalation. A defensive measure could be seen as preparation for offensive action. In such an environment, perception becomes as important as reality, and managing perception becomes a strategic priority. This is where the concept of multi-domain conflict reaches its highest level. According to analysts, the current situation represents a form of hybrid warfare that integrates military action, economic disruption, and psychological influence. Each domain reinforces the others, creating a complex system that is difficult to control. And within this system, energy remains the central axis. Because control over energy, whether through production, disruption, or stabilization, translates directly into strategic leverage. This brings us to the long-term outlook. According to analysts, the future of this conflict is likely to be defined by three key trends. First, the continued integration of economic targets into military strategy. Energy infrastructure will remain a focal point, not as an exception, but as a standard component of conflict. Second, the expansion of strategic competition beyond the region. As global powers respond to instability, their involvement, direct or indirect, will shape the broader geopolitical landscape. Third, the increasing importance of resilience. Countries that can protect their infrastructure, maintain stable supply chains, and absorb economic shocks will hold a strategic advantage. Those that cannot will face growing pressure. And this leads to a final, overarching conclusion. According to analysts, the attack on Saudi oil refineries is not an isolated event. It is a signal that the nature of conflict is changing, a signal that economic systems are now central to strategic competition, and a signal that the boundaries between regional conflict and global impact are becoming increasingly blurred. In this new environment, victory is no longer defined solely by military outcomes. It is defined by the ability to influence systems, manage risk, and sustain advantage over time. And as the situation continues to develop, one thing remains clear. The conflict is not just about territory. It is about control over the mechanisms that power the modern world. And those mechanisms are now under pressure. Please tune in for a more detailed analysis in the next video.